Here's something that should bother every leader responsible for organizational communication. You can have the most sophisticated data infrastructure in the world. You can segment your audience into dozens of behavioral cohorts. You can optimize every send time and every subject line, and your communication can still land with the emotional weight of a form letter. And on the other side, well, you can write the most compelling, psychologically resonant narrative ever crafted and send it entirely to the wrong people at the wrong moment. The first problem is what happens when you have data without craft. The second is what happens when you have craft without data. And most organizations are operating with one or the other, but never both. Today, we're going to explore what happens at the intersection of those two capabilities, why neither one alone is sufficient to move people during periods of change and transformation, and what the research tells us about the psychology of communication that actually changes behavior. I have two guests who embody this intersection so very well. One has spent decades mastering the craft of language, of narrative, and editorial strategy. The other operates data-driven communication at one of the largest technology companies in the world. They represent two halves of a capability that most organizations have never successfully integrated. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. This is season 2. We have spent this season building a diagnostic framework for why transformation fails at the human level. Identity crisis, emotional contagion, structural traps, algorithmic mirrors, the organizational immune system, structural silence, the psychological contract, generational fault lines, and even covering the diagnostic map that showed how all of those dimensions interact as a system. Today, well, we're applying that framework to a specific domain where these dynamics converge in ways that most organizations handle poorly: communication. Communication is how organizations attempt to move people. It is how leaders announce change, how associations engage members, how institutions maintain trust, and how transformation gets translated from strategy into action. And well, the research tells us that the way most organizations communicate is fundamentally misaligned with how people actually process information, how they form trust, and when they decide to act. The data on this is sobering. Research published in the Journal of Consumer Research shows that psychographic-driven campaigns outperform demographically targeted ones by up to 87%. Nielsen Consumer Research confirmed that messaging aligned to psychological motivations generates 2 to 3 times the response rate compared to demographic targeting alone. And on the association side, member-wise digital excellence research found that only 17% of association members describe the communications they receive as highly relevant. More than 8 out of 10 people feel like you're not really talking to them. But here's the thing those statistics don't tell you. Psychographic targeting without editorial craft just means you are sending personalized mediocrity, and brilliant writing sent to an unsegmented list is a magnificent message that reaches the completely wrong people at the completely wrong time. The organizations that actually move people through communication have figured out how to integrate both. And that integration is what this episode is all about. To explore this, I am joined by two people I have worked closely with who represent both sides of this equation. Deborah Patton is the COO at The Robin Report and co author of my first book, The Truth About Transformation. Deborah has spent decades in publishing, editorial strategy, and brand communications. She has helped revitalize traditional brands and launch new media businesses. She has worked with me for more than 10 years, and she carries something that I think is increasingly rare in organizational communication: the ability to hear language the way the reader hears it, not the way the writer intended. That distinction is the difference between communications that connects and communications that perform. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm happy to be here.
And Justin Thorp is the Director of Email Marketing and Audience Strategy at Oracle, where he runs communication strategy at an enterprise scale that most organizations simply can't imagine. Before Oracle, Justin held roles at 500 startups and Hello Wallet. And before all of that, I recruited Justin to the Library of Congress when he graduated from RIT, which is where our professional relationship began many years ago. Justin brings something equally rare on the other side: the ability to read behavioral data and understand what it's actually telling people about why people engage, not just whether they do. Justin, welcome.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So, before we get into the research, I want to set the stage with a question that I think will surface where your perspectives converge and where they diverge, because I know there are times that it diverges. When an organization's communications consistently underperform, what's the actual problem? Not the symptoms, not the metrics, but what is actually going wrong at the human level? Deborah.
Okay, there are a lot of things. First of all, a lot of people write for themselves because they think it's their own personal bias. They think everyone thinks the same way they do and is interested in the same things that they are. And that puts you in a big trap as a writer because that has nothing to do with who you're writing for. It only has to do with yourself. So they end up selling, not telling, and they're not inviting people into what you're communicating. My mantra always is, what does it mean? Why does it matter? And what does it matter to you? Why do you care personally about what I'm telling you? Another thing is people focus on the wrong narrative. They're so proud of what they're saying and what they've got to sell that they miss what connects with the audience. It's all about them, not the person that they're trying to recruit or woo into their whatever they're selling. And then the other thing's a little more ephemeral, but people don't appeal to a higher sense of self. They don't find the purpose, the reason, the something that transcends the actual transactional aspect of what you're writing about, but where's the common ground? How do we connect? It's more of an emotional messaging, and it's complicated because it changes every time you write. But it's that weird kind of mix of emotion, psychology, empathy, and higher purpose. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. Justin.
I mean, I completely agree with Deborah. I think there's a real gap in empathy in that we're often too lazy to think about ourselves or think about what we're trying to communicate from the perspective of the reader and what they would potentially find everything interesting. I think of marketing, be it an email or other channels, kind of like a mirror, right? And when the reader looks at that mirror, what is it that they're going to see? When it's the best marketing, the marketing that I've seen has been the most successful. When the reader, the consumer is looking at that mirror, they see themselves. We're all too often, when marketers who are less successful put themselves at the center of the equation. And then when the reader sees their marketing, they see the product or the company or the organization or the person who's doing the communicating. That doesn't land as successfully. When I send out marketing, my goal is that I want someone to see that marketing and I want to be like, wow, you understand me. You understand me, my problems. And there's that bond, that trust that's created from that. On the other side, often, so my channel is email. We have the everything email, the email that's trying to do all things for all people.
People. Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Having done this now for almost 2 decades, like I could tell you what the stats are going to be for those emails before they go out, right? Because I just have seen it so much and they fail every time.
So, what you're both describing connects to the tension that I think most organizations have never resolved. And it maps directly to what psychologist Daphne Osserman at USC, and she's been studying her work on identity-based motivation theory. So Oyserman's research tells us that people are more likely to take action when that action feels congruent with who they believe themselves to be, not who they are on paper. So who they see themselves as. So demographics tell you who on paper, psychographics tell you the who in their head, but neither one tells you how to speak to them in language that actually lands. And so that is the craft dimension that you guys were both mentioning. So I see two failure models in organizational communications, and they almost always present it as if one is more sophisticated than the other. The first is the organization that writes beautiful communications, well crafted narratives, clear calls to action, professional tone, and sends them to everyone the same way. They have craft, but no data. The second is the organization that has behavioral segments, engagement scores, predictive models, and A/B testing infrastructure, and uses all of that to deliver messages that read like they were written by a committee or generated completely by a template engine. In today's terms of AI, that's happening more often than it should be. So they have data, but no craft. So the research is clear that both fail, but they fail for different reasons. The craft without data organization writes something compelling and then broadcast it, and hoping relevance will be achieved through quality alone. The data without craft organization targets precisely and delivers something that is psychologically completely inert. The engagement data looks optimized, but the downstream behavior, the actual change in what people do, never materializes. They just don't take action. So, Deborah, you spent your career in the craft of editorial communication, understanding how language, structure, tone, and narrative actually move people. And it is an expertise that I have over the years benefited from, and one that slowly has altered my own writing style over time. So when you look at organizations that have invested heavily in data and segmentation, but are still producing communications that feel so very generic, what are they missing? And because I always ask complicated questions, what is the gap between knowing who your audience is and actually reaching them?
So I would have a couple of things to say about that. First of all, data is really useful information, but it's not storytelling. And as cliched as it might sound, you need to figure out how to get into the hearts and the heads and the minds of your audience. And data, sometimes they collect the wrong data. It's transactional, but it doesn't explain the motivation and why people do what they do. So you're probably asking the wrong questions in the first place. I think also in terms of data, you need to separate needs from wants. Data is typically impersonal and it doesn't go into these deeper realms of what I said before about motivation. So if you were really to be smart, and Justin, you can correct me, and I'm sure you'll have a different attitude, but if you could figure out how to collect data that explains the benefits to somebody of whatever it is you're trying to communicate instead of just trying to get their money out of them, I think it goes back again to asking the wrong questions. So you can't write a script based on data. It can give you some insights. It can give you some intuition and some benchmarks of where people are. But you have to come up with what is really compelling and what are those touch points as a writer. You can use data to sort of inform that, but I always see data as after the fact, not before the fact. So it ends up being kind of in reverse order. And it isn't easy. None of this is easy because everybody's different. Their touch points are different. And frankly, it's kind of exhausting as a writer to be able to do this because you have to be able to morph into all different ways of thinking and all different attitudes. So I would go back to, from my perspective, you got to you have to ask the right questions in the first place, or the obverse of that is you're probably asking the wrong questions with your data.
So Justin, on the data side, and you can talk about the craft as well, because I know you spend a lot of time on that. So when you look at organizations that produce genuinely well-written communications, but to your earlier point, they are communicating to all. They have no segmentation strategy, no behavioral data, no way to understand who is engaging and why. What does that failure look like at scale? And what are they leaving on the table?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think Deborah and I are similar, but start to diverge, right? Where she comes with the data last, I come with the data first. My data and the data that we leverage, or the data that I advise on, is really there to help me know my audience, right? How do I look at that audience first? Is that's going to help me to most effectively empathize with who I'm getting in front of, so that way I can create that relevancy. The difference between something landing and not is ensuring that the person who I'm getting this craft, getting this beautiful artisanal product that Deborah or someone like her is creating, to making sure that I get it to the right people at the right time, at the right stage of their relationship. These are all different dimensions that we leverage, that we have data for. I need to have that data so that I can ensure that I get the right message from Deborah to the right user at the right time. Otherwise, it won't work, and it's the opposite of love. The thing that I don't worry about is not unsubscribes from my emails. It's apathy, right? I worry about someone just seeing it and not caring. I don't want to become part of the background noise. The difference between a content and an advertisement isn't whether it's paid or not, it's relevance, right? No one cares about whether or not something was paid for if I find it actually interesting, right? It's all about targeting, and that's where the data is required. But it requires that I actually give something great to my audience, which is where the part that Deborah does day in and day out is absolutely paramount.
So here's a question for you both, right? And it's an integration question. So in the years that we have collaborated together, we've tried to bring these two capabilities together. So Deborah, you write the communications. Justin, at Oracle, you operate the systems that deliver them. So when these two sides actually connect, what changes? Can you each describe a moment where you saw craft and data working together and the result was qualitatively different from either one alone?
Justin, you go first.
It's the difference in the end. I mean, both starts with the data, moves to the craft, but then it ends in the data, right? I'm able to look at and see every time we send an email out, if we have both craft and data working in harmony, we wildly surpass every benchmark that we put out there, right? That we advise people on, right? Because people want great content, they want great messages. And when you can get the right message to the right person at the right time, they engage with it at extraordinary levels, right? And you can drive human behavior, but you have to understand people with the data and provide them a quality product in order to do that.
So I would add to that situation, for me, in my experience, is sort of unique. It takes a very sophisticated company, a very sophisticated person like Justin, to be able to help somebody like me enhance or amplify what I'm writing. But my experience with most media companies, and God, I've worked for so many of them, and their marketing communications teams are clueless about what Justin's talking about. They don't have the right software. They don't have the right database management systems. They don't have a Justin who's sensitive to this information. They're just working at like schisms. So it's kind of goodbye and good luck. And then, oh, after the fact, oh, that really tanked, and you clueless. You're not, well, you might have an intuition, but you don't really know why, because you don't have any coaching that gets you there in the first place. So that's why I'm saying most of my experience about data has been after the fact, not before the fact.
And I think that's where AI changes everything, right? That with the power of artificial intelligence, right? It's the people who have that base foundation, the people who have the well organized data and the culture of curiosity, now powered with AI, are going to leapfrog past everyone else, because my ability to both understand the data and then create copy with an artisan, right? Not without an artisan, but with an artisan with the AI, my ability to serve 90% of the quality at 10 times the scale is, I'm going to dwarf everyone else in the process.
So that brings up a whole different point that actually we haven't talked about at all, is the actual writing itself. Because I personally, and I know I'm old school, I cannot stand AI writing. And to get to the point where you can prompt it and it can be sort of an avatar voice for yourself is very time consuming. You have to be dedicated, passionate. You have to have the technology expertise to do it in the first place, because I field so much writing from people that write for me And I can tell when it's AI, it's formulaic, it's boring, it has no soul, and has basically nothing to do with the audience. It's just this peppy, formulaic bullshit, basically. So I agree with Justin, and we all know where this is headed. The people who are going to succeed are the ones that work in tandem with AI and help and deploy it to make them better at what they do. But we're at this in between point right now where that's not happening. People are either just writing this junk, doing what Justin said, but not massaging it, not owning it. So we're at a hinge point here.
And let me diverge a little bit here because you guys both hit on a very interesting dynamic. And you have small companies, large companies, a very fast, short tenure for most marketing communication professionals, right? 12 to 18 months is what they last. And then they're moving on to the next company, organization, or so forth. You both mentioned the gap and that there's gaps in what people are focused on, gaps in what data may be available, or if they don't know what data is available and how to leverage that. So, how does that play into things? Deborah, I'll turn to you because when you mentioned the variety of media companies where those staff do not know what they're doing, and so there's a lot of money and time being spent on the effort, but not necessarily the results.
So this is a way of answering your question. I would say if we just go to what I do for the Robin Report, which is for senior level executives, I work with a bunch of very young people, marvelous, smart, very enthusiastic young people. They're convinced that the best way to communicate is through reels, social media, short form videos, anything that moves, you know, that you don't have to read for a long time. On the other hand, when we did our reader survey, all our executives want is long form journalism. They can't stand podcasts, they can't stand webinars, they don't have time to watch or listen to them. So if we communicate that to them, they want the transcripts so they can scan them. So, and I'm not, you know, vilifying generational gaps, but I think this is a question of that you think you know best, but if you don't know your audience, it's immaterial. So just because it's cool and chic and hot stuff to do this new form of communication, it doesn't mean that it resonates with your audience. So it goes back to what we've been talking about, you whether it's data that provides this experience, talking to people, talking to your audience as opposed to just studying them. You have to know who you're writing for. And I think a lot of marketing teams, as I said before, they know best. It's their bias that they're smarter than everyone else in the room and that they have the smartest way to address these problems. That makes sense.
What would be fascinating with the research you did on what the different content types for the Robin Report would be is to put both out and then look at the engagement data to figure out whether or not their expressed interest actually matches their implicit behavior.
It does.
Well, that's good.
We don't collect the amount of data that you do, but it's very clear that the clicks, page views are very small for all of the broadcast communications we do compared to the written journalism. I mean, it's very
It's,
old school.
it's a
It's counter trend, but
it's a mistake though. It's a bias that people have, right? They have a bias towards their own or what they
of
think they
course,
want, and often what their explicit interests and their implicit behavior are two different things. I mean, that's great that in your instance that they actually match up, but it's something that you always want to check because I think often people think that they know how they receive information, but then their actual behavior differs entirely.
totally. I totally agree. In this case, I can validate it. So it's just not my opinion or my own
Yeah.
bias, but
No,
it's
that's
also
great. I
because I
mean,
know the audience,
it's the Netflix queue phenomenon, right? There's everyone's got two Netflix queues. There's your aspirational Netflix queue. I like to think that I'm the person who would watch, documentaries and, art
Mm.
house TV shows, but I watch, Below Deck and, various other things that are utterly mind numbing, right? Your implicit and explicit behaviors actually, or explicit interest in your implicit behaviors are inherently different.
So,
And it also,
let me
I'm
talk
so,
to, let me set this up because,
okay.
several weeks ago, I spoke at the ASAE Membership Marketing and Communications Conference downtown DC. And much of what I'm representing and why, and us putting together this episode is what transformed into that presentation. So there were some research frameworks that tie this all together. And Justin, you hit on this about people's implicit and explicit behaviors, because there are three psychological drivers that determine whether someone genuinely engages with a communication or they simply process it and move on. So these are not abstract concepts. They're the mechanisms through which both craft and data either succeed or fail. And so the first driver is identity-based motivation, and it's from Oyserman's research. When a communication reinforces someone's sense of who they are, right, engagement goes up. When it treats them as a line item in a database, engagement dies. So think about the difference between a renewal email that says your membership or your subscription expires on July 31. Click here to renew, update your credit card, or so forth, versus one that says, as a member subscriber of this community, you've been part of shaping these critical industry standards this year. That's not just a membership subscription, it's a professional identity worth continuing. And that correlates in many ways to professional or for personal relationships. And they're the same as completely different psychological framing. So Oyserman's research predicts, and our testing confirms across a variety of different clients, that the second version outperforms the first by a significant margin. But here's the critical point. The second version requires both the data to know what the member actually contributed and the craft to frame it in language that resonates rather than just completely flatters. So neither capability alone produces it. The second driver is what I call trust architecture, and it draws on Paul Zach's Neuroscience of Trust research published in Harvard Business Review. So Zach identified behaviors that stimulate oxytocin production, the neurochemical foundation of trust. Three translate directly to communication. So it's the recognition of excellence, information transparency, and autonomy. So when your communications celebrate contributions, share information honestly, including challenges and uncertainties, and give people choices about how they engage rather than prescribing a single path, you're building a neurochemical trust with that customer, subscriber, or member. And again, this requires both dimensions. So the data tells you what to recognize. The craft determines whether the recognition feels genuine or performative. And any experienced communicator knows that the line between those two is entirely a function of language. And Deborah, I've learned so much from you in that regard. The third driver is behavioral activation. So drawn from clinical psychology and adapted for organizational communications. The research on retention tells us the first 90 days for any subscriber, customer, member determines whether someone stays. And it's not because they evaluated the value proposition and found it lacking, but because they never activated the behavioral patterns that create what organizational psychologists Mitchell and Lee call psychological embeddedness. So it's the links, it's the fit, and the sacrifice that weave someone into a community. So, Deborah, these three drivers, identity, trust, and behavioral activation, again, which I have learned so much from you, are psychological mechanisms, but they only work if the language carries them. You can't data engineer trust. You can't algorithmically produce identity reinforcement. Someone has to write the words that make those mechanisms fire. How do you approach that? How do you get in people's heads when you sit down to write a communication that needs to actively identify building trust? What is happening in the editorial process that makes the difference between something that connects and something that just sounds like it should?
I think it's hard. I think you have to be almost like a chameleon. You have to let go of your ego and your bias. So you have to, it takes a lot of empathy. I mean, to go back to what we talked about before, to understand how people are and what they think. And the one thing we haven't talked about is writing for what they want to become, which is yet another angle in writing for persuasion. I think the biggest unlock for all of this, though, is to know at what stage these various mindsets or psychologies exist. And most of us don't have that kind of enhanced information and data. So you're kind of doing it through logic and common sense. But if you're really doing segmented communications and you don't have a Justin to tell you, and you aren't measuring through data what these different psychological states are, then it's kind of like guesswork. I think it's this fusion of the art and science of it. And again, I go back to having a really strong team, data analytics team behind you that can guide you as a writer as to, who's who and who are we writing for. But most of us don't have that level of specificity in terms of our audience. I mean, it's wonderful that they've done this research, but I wouldn't say that there's a whole lot of databases that segment it that way.
Go ahead, Justin.
Say persona development is a big thing for me. We create a lot of personas around the different types of people that we're writing for, and then do a fair amount of research either through qualitative conversations, or honestly we utilize AI to produce personas that, I don't know, ChatGPT is able to pull together every post from every subreddit about esoteric topics. I'm not able to do that. And so it's able to provide insights into the motivations beyond or behind someone who's a chief medical informatics officer in a way that I never will be able to. And so that's able to provide me then insight into the motivations behind that role inside of a major hospital system in a way that will help to inform how I go and advise a specific team about how to approach their communication strategy, which will then dovetail into how I pull the email segment to ensure that the right message is getting to the right audience.
I totally understand that, but if I could just add one thing, I think it's any writer who's like paying attention can figure out at different career stages in terms of roles and responsibilities that you're writing for, whether it's in medical profession or tech or something like that. But what Kevin's talking about is way deeper than that, and I think it's very hard to ferret out if they're trust or identity or what these different psychographics are, because that doesn't necessarily conform to the role you play in business. It conforms more to where you are in a purchase decision process, about choice, how you value things. And I just don't think that very many companies, at least that I've worked with, are at that level of sophistication to match what the psychiatrists and sociologists are coming up with in terms of what actually gets into them and what triggers a decision or a behavior.
So what I think is interesting, and it's interesting to me that those organizations that you spoke to that aren't doing that, I think they themselves forget that those are their people and they have their
No,
needs,
yeah,
right? They have their needs, wants, and preferences, and somehow they forget how to, well, they forget to recognize that and that they are actually talking and interacting with people and trying to get people to purchase, to join, to take some action. They don't take the time to get to know those people.
right. I
It's a
mean,
deep
it's a whole they could go on for 2 hours about that because you need a Justin, a super smart Justin, whom he is, to help you figure that out. But I think the bigger issue, if you wanted to look at it from a macro cultural perspective, is that we live in a transactional framework mindset right now in our country, at least. And because it's so focused on transaction, the whole need for empathy, the understand the motivation, the different psychologies, nobody cares. They just like, let's make a deal. Let's close the deal. And I think it goes back to what the leitmotif of this that we've been talking about is that we've lost a sense of empathy, and marketers like, make my quota, sell it, get tickets to the event, sell the books, whatever it is, without understanding why anybody would want to do it in the first place,
I heard
without the help of Justin. you know?
and there is a data aspect to it too, but I think often there's just a common sense that gets forgotten. Years ago, I heard a great, like a legendary Silicon Valley product marketer say that great product marketing is not about how your product kicks ass. It's about how
yes,
I help you kick ass.
yes.
And it
Right.
all comes back to that identity, right? I'm here to make you a better version of yourself at work, to make you feel empowered, to make it feel like I'm solving your problems. And that's when the message becomes successful. And when that gets lost, regardless of the channel, regardless of whether you have data or not, right? Your message isn't going to be successful.
Yeah, it's a perfect example if you're working like we work with retailers where the retailers just think about selling their stuff. They forget that the customer is going to buy it. And if you're not customer centric, whatever your profession or discipline or industry is, you've lost, as soon as you walk out of the gate, your focus is in the wrong place.
Yes, and I think anybody who, since COVID, receives the quantity of emails from different companies, because I don't think the quantity has lessened since then. There are so many organizations and companies continuing to completely miss that connection, and they can't be doing well. So I want to ask you something because you work at a scale that many people couldn't even conceptualize. And so you can measure opens and clicks. But how do you measure whether trust was built or identity was reinforced? And you mentioned identity. It's one of the biggest things I always talk about. So at Oracle's scale, what signals tell you that a communication connected at the psychological level versus just performing well on the surface metrics?
I mean, I think it's not just looking at the singular point in time, but it's looking at a trend over time, right? We're not, or I'm not just thinking about this one communication or this one marketing program. I'm thinking about how this is progressing you in the sense of a relationship, right? I want to continue to evolve you, to mature you, to nurture you, to make you feel like you trust Oracle or whomever more so with every time that we try to communicate. So that hopefully at some point that matures into you wanting to purchase a product. And it's that you continuing to come back and you continuing to engage and you continuing to engage, it acts as kind of a proxy for that continued building of trust.
So would you correlate that trend analysis to, in many ways, a relationship?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all marketing is relationships. I mean, all business is a hospitality business. All business is a people business, and digital marketing is just relationships at scale.
So Deborah, from the editorial side, and picking up on what Justin just mentioned, are there signals that you pick up that the data miss? So things that you notice in reader responses, because I know you analyze these in the ways that people reference communications back to you and the language they use when they engage, that they tell you something connected at a deeper level.
So I think, just to be totally honest, you're really lucky if people respond and give you a ton of feedback. And they separate self-selectively into like really happy people and they love what you're doing or they're super pissed off at you. So for me, if I don't hear anything, I feel like I'm probably doing okay because I haven't irritated anybody and I'm just assuming that I'm okay with everyone else. But I don't have the sophisticated data backup that Justin would provide to validate that. I think what's increasingly hard, especially for somebody in my position, is that nobody has time to respond to anything unless it's set up as a dedicated chat sharing LinkedIn community, something like that. But when you're doing communications, marketing communications, you use all your tools, all your resources, all your intuition to everything that we've talked about to hit the mark. But even in corporate communications, when I was doing it for Nielsen, you'd hear like, "Oh, that was great. I'm so excited." And you kind of wonder if that was true and they would just want to make sure that they were on your good side. Or you hear like, "Oh, this is awful. Do I have to do this again?" But it's not common. It's not you don't get waves and waves of response. You have to invite it. You have to ask for feedback. You're not going to get it unless you really promote that there's a forum for them to give it to you.
So to digress on something that you mentioned then, so is the lack of feedback a challenge in organizations because then they feel that they're doing well and not recognizing the human reality, right? That most people are not going to comment. They're not going to hit like. They've seen it, they've interacted with it, they may have read it, perhaps they even took action. But your only confirmation then is that they took the action.
Well, I think it's in data in Justin's world. You can tell if people open something or looked at it or clicked through it. I mean, that's where the data on the backside, the end result, can give you some long-term pattern recognition, I guess, of whether you're hitting it or not hitting it. But that's today in digital marketing, that's like about the only tool you have that you can rely on, unless you've got a really enthusiastic crowd of people that just love to talk to you. But if you're going to an executive C-suite type of audience, forget it. They barely have time to do anything. So you have to know your audience and also manage your expectations. So if you're some 23-year-old and you think everybody's going to respond because it's a TikTok thing and it's like, oh yeah, 100,000 billion likes, as somebody who's running a retail department store is not going to do that. But we know that they read our material because they tell us anecdotally when we run into them and meet them, but they don't take time to write. So again, you have to have a lot of confidence to do this and kind of a thick skin, and you can't take this stuff personally, but you do have to pay attention to your audience and understand who they are, to go back to what Justin said, the roles they
I
play
think
in a business.
coincidentally, is that confidence. I think also that comes in parallel with vulnerability, right?
Yeah,
That go side by side, and that sounds counterintuitive, right? You can't be confident
no.
and vulnerable, right? I think they absolutely come in parallel. That in order to feel confident enough to put yourself out there, right, you have to be willing to put yourself out there.
Well, I think you have to have faith. You have faith that you understand who you're writing for, and faith in them that you're going to provide something that's worth their time to read it and to respond to it. But again, that goes into this very ephemeral space because faith is not very easily measured by data.
But
So
then the data on the back end, right, to pull in like, hey, did this work, right? Like,
Yeah,
is this working, right? And if not, why, right? And then to have done enough to start to see, okay, like when I talk about this, it
yeah, yeah.
doesn't work. When I talk about this, it does seem to work. Maybe it's saying that I shouldn't talk about this, or maybe it says I should talk about this other thing differently in interpreting the data or experimenting and how you interpret that data.
You're absolutely right. As an editor of a media brand, you can tell when nobody cares. I mean, it's obvious in the numbers. It doesn't show up like overnight, but that long-term pattern. And then you say, okay, so this is just not interesting to them. And then you do a reader survey and you find out it isn't interesting, but you can do it both ways.
Yeah, you can't always trust that data, right? It never ceases to amaze me the content that I put out personally. No one engaged with it on social media whatsoever. And then I talked to someone anecdotally, and they were like, Justin, that was the best piece I've ever
No,
read in my
I know.
entire life. And I was like,
Some
damn, I thought I was talking to a black hole, right?
to personalize that, yes, I with the newsletter and even this podcast, I feel that same sometimes where you feel that you're putting stuff out into a black hole. And then you get the random email. Last week, there were 3 texts from 3 different people, a couple LinkedIn messages saying that was so incredibly helpful. And so, to Deborah's point, people just, whether it's a time issue, whether they're intimidated, it resonates with them, but they don't often let you know.
So there's sort of a lesson here is that you need to get out. We get so stuck and so focused on what we do, and we're sort of working with our heads down all the time. But whenever I go to events or conferences, everybody says, oh my God, it's the first thing I read every morning. Oh, I couldn't live without it. Now, you would never know that waiting for them to tell you that while you're sitting locked onto your computer. So it does require being in the world, being with people so that people don't take the time to write. But so you have to have the confidence that they are reading,
And
caring.
I think to build onto that, right? I think having curiosity, right? Enough of a desire, or curiosity is baked into part of your culture so that you have the desire to want to get out and see what the real world actually looks like, to talk to those people, to ask questions, to look at the data. I think the curiosity and kind of creating that culture inside your organization to make it that something that you actually desire is an essential part of that.
Let me ask a question around AI because you guys both hit on this earlier. So, in a world that we know that is becoming more and more impersonal and more digital driven, how then, if AI is writing those communications, is monitoring those communications, Where is the human comprehension in that? To both your points about the necessity to get out and talk to people, but AI is theoretically taking care of the system.
Justin's better qualified to speak to this, but in my opinion, you've got agents talking to agents. And then you start to wonder, well, what the hell? People are doing search and their agents are talking to another agent, talking to another agent to accrue all this information and aggregate it into something meaningful. And as a writer and all the writers I work with, I think we feel, as confident as we are, I think we feel extremely threatened by being disintermediated by systems, talking to systems, and you start to game it. When you do digital communications, you game it for the agents, you don't game it for the human being anymore. That's why I say we're in a hinge point,
Hmm.
and when I'm not quite sure where it's going to go ultimately, but being in the middle of all of this as we find our way is frustrating and confusing, frankly.
So I mean, I think there's a reality to automation playing an increasing role in all of our lives. That being said, at least from everything that I've read historically, as automation has increased over time, including things like the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
that the increase in value of artisanship and the increase in the desire,
Diametrically, yeah.
like it
Mhm.
goes for craft, like goes up. And so I would think of anything, right? Be it with writing marketing communications to Hollywood, that there's going to be a desire for authentic communication, for authentic craft to increase pretty dramatically as we move to a space where automation becomes even easier to do things. That being said, I truly think that craft and AI can go hand in hand and will. That being said, though, the heart has to still be there. The brain still has to be there, of which, I mean, at least for the foreseeable future, I really don't see AI being able to do it in the same way or do it without a Deborah
Hmm.
in there in the mix.
Hmm.
So we've trademarked, which I think we're going to put onto future communications, trademarked always human, never AI. I just have to make sure the writers honor that because it's so tempting to do all this research and then to not turn that research into your own voice. And we're all new to this, but I can spot it immediately. And it's very hard to edit because it's so perfect. It's perfectly written and the grammar is perfect and the spelling is perfect, except that it doesn't sound real in terms of opinionated, insightful content with a perspective. So again, back to my hinge point, we're sort of muddling our way through where this is going to eventually take us from an editorial perspective.
So I want to flip back to the psychological segmentation. And so it categorizes people by who they are and how they relate to an organization psychologically. And so there are four primary mindsets. And one is the identity seeker. And it's someone for whom belonging is the primary driver. They join, they engage, they purchase, they stayed because it reinforces who they see themselves as personally or professionally. The second is the knowledge acquirer. They're driven by trust. So, specifically, the information transparency dimension. They want depth, to Deborah, to your point, on likely your readers. They want the depth, they want the exclusivity and the expertise that they can't find elsewhere. Then there's the network builder, and they're driven by behavioral activation through social connection. They're in it for the people, not the content. And the passive consumer is someone whose identity salience has completely faded, whose trust has simply not been activated, and whose behavioral patterns have not been established. So, critically, passive consumers are always temporal state, right? Because they're not a personality type. So, the power of using those categories changes what both sides of the equation can and need to do. The data side needs to identify which mindset each person is operating from and detect when they shift. And the craft side needs to write communications that speak each mindset differently, not with different facts, but with different emotional architecture. So, Deborah, this is where I think your expertise becomes most visible. And again, the years of working with you and what I have learned from you. So, when you sit down to write four versions of the same communication for four different mindsets, and the ask is the same: a renewal, an event invitation, a transformation announcement. but the craft is completely different. And you mentioned this earlier that it can be exhausting, right? So, how does the language change? How does the emotional architecture shift? And can you walk us through what moves in the writing when that mindset changes?
Oh, it sounds like a cliche, but you have to walk in their heads and in their shoes. And so, therefore, you have to understand with these different mindsets or archetypes, whatever we want to call them, what motivates them. And that is everything we've been talking about, hearing people, not just listening to them, understanding people, common sense, just how human behavior works. I mean, any person who's really good at this studies people from whatever vantage point, whether it's pop culture or intellectual material or news and what's going on in the world. You cannot isolate yourself and be able to communicate. So you channel them. You channel into them and you're not you. It's like, what are their triggers? What are their touch points? But the only thing that I worry about with this convenient model that you've just described is that people are any of those things in the same person.
No, it's
It
always
depends on the
situation.
situation.
Always
It's
situation.
the situation that determines it. So it's a little tricky to write for a static psychological mindset or approach because I could be a passive consumer about one thing and totally the opposite for something else. So it gets very tricky to try and follow a matrix like that unless you've got Justin and his team to be able to really identify that for that particular product at that particular moment in their life, that's the mindset that they're living. And boy, that's an ideal world to me as a writer. I you have to be incredibly sophisticated to sell something based on that kind of information.
I want to hit on because Justin mentioned the Netflix queue earlier and in the presentation, and I actually was trying to find a different example to use, but Netflix checked all the boxes because Netflix, yes, is using data, right? But it's using your behavioral patterns of what you've watched to make predictions of
Like
what,
Amazon. Yeah.
yes, right? Amazon the same. And for many organizations out there who are struggling, they are not looking at what they themselves are experiencing with companies like Amazon or Netflix, where they are mapping your psychology based on your prior behaviors, your likes, your dislikes. And to Justin and both actually your earlier point of talking to people about the benefits, Justin, your Silicon Valley example there, which is critical and it keeps being forgotten. And maybe it's that people are just so busy, head down, trying to do their job and marketing and communicating without trying to build that connection.
I think this gets us into a realm of predictability and whether you really can measure predictability. I think you can, I mean, everybody talks about measuring intent in it as opposed to reverse engineer the transaction history. And uh, that is what is it, Justin? Some psychographic data and analytics or something, some new field within data collection that has this overlay on it to understand choice and intent. I mean, because mostly we just have transaction data. And then you have to make logical conclusions based either a persona that you've built, like a whole system of people, persona peoples, or common sense. But I think still a lot of guesswork, in my
It's the
opinion.
reason why I'm in digital marketing and not an open heart surgeon, right? Like they can't make mistakes. Like I make mistakes all the time, right? It's just I've been doing this for 20 years now, and you start to pick up on what people respond to and what they don't, right? If I put introducing or announcing in a subject line, that intrigues people, right? And I see the data go up on the open rate because it's like that's some sort of psychological keyword to say there's something big that's happening right now because they said announcing and people read left to right. And so the first word that they read is announcing, and that gives them a hit of something that's about to happen. And so, I mean, I think there's an intuitive, I mean, there's a head knowledge. You can start to read about that as theory inside of a book. But there's also, I've just sent a lot of email and tried everything and failed a lot and
Yeah,
have
no, I
figured
know.
out.
Yeah.
Like you see the data, right? You're like, hey, I did this and this happened. I did it again and it still happens, right? Like, wait, that's a trend, right? Like data is starting to cue me to human behavior and how to start tying into those psychological cues of what's going to drive someone to take action.
So all of this is true, but time is not necessarily on our side. And to fail and to experiment and to find that sweet spot that you're talking about, usually we're so time constrained because of the deadlines of meeting whatever target or goal it is. You don't have a lot of latitude to fail too often or experiment too often, and then you that's what ends up kind of making the equilibrium of mediocre communications, because you're out of time, you're out of options, you're out of everything, and you get lazy, and that becomes a self-defeating
So,
prophecy.
so is that because of the system, whether
Maybe.
it's a small media company or large corporation, where there's a calendar, all the
Hmm.
different products, services, offerings, events, and so forth are on that calendar. In some regards, many of those things are trying to reach the larger group of people and then segment to encourage those people to take action based on their interest or the benefits. And so it's a machine, right? It's a very large system. So it's the system itself actually preventing the critical thinking and the thought process that's needed to make improvements.
We talked about feedback and the importance of getting feedback, and it's also like soliciting that feedback yourself. Like we have a, or at least I push kind of a cultural value of questioning everything productively. That we inside of myself, my team, the teams that I work with, it's all about how can we look at and ask like, hey, did this work? Did this not work? What could I do better the next time? Is I had a boss who would always say, let's try to suck 1% less every single day, right? And if that's true, that compounding growth, I mean, that drives towards a lot, right? But you need that culture where we're never just sitting still, we're never just resting on our laurels. We're always trying to figure out how can we improve and how do we take it one step further. I mean, it comes back to that again, the hunger or curiosity, including with people. Like it's more data, more life experience.
There's another thing too that we haven't talked about at all, is that I think the people from a writing perspective, I think the people who are good at this are systems thinkers. They connect things holistically, so they see how everything's interconnected. And sometimes data doesn't fall into that very conveniently because data is in these discrete silos, and it's making the connections with all these data points is how does it fit together into a larger system. And people live in these complex systems. They don't live in independent siloed ways of thinking or behaving. And I think that that's certainly an opportunity with the creative team and the data team, where they can interact and and help each other better by embracing the fact that it's not fact, transaction, but how do all these things connect into a larger system? Because that's how people really act. That's how they behave in a complex system.
What would your top three piece of advice be for an organization that is trying to make improvement?
I mean, in the end, I think it really all comes back to the basics. I mean, I feel like majority of the tips really come back to embracing putting your audience first, right? Understanding your audience. How do we look at the data? That doesn't mean that we're not going to utilize the crap, but we use the data at least initially as a way of helping to understand who we're going after in order to help inform the craft of the writing communication in order to make sure it's the most effective possible. I think getting out, like we talked about, is a great tip. And then being open to asking questions and to challenging each other directly. You care personally, but you challenge directly. The reason why I'm able to challenge my colleagues around their approaches, right? It's because they know that I care about them and who they are, and that we're all trying to move towards personal growth. And it's crazy. You would think, oh, it's some flashy tool, AI, data, and yes to all those things, right? But I think the biggest things that really decide whether or not something's going to be successful or not is so much more basic, right? Do you know who you're talking to? Are you taking the extra effort to get to know them well, to understand what's behind them and who they're after, and then how the data could potentially lead you to that? But then when you have data on the other side, did it work like you thought it would? Did you have a clear understanding of what your goal was from the onset, right? These are all the basics, which I think in 80% problems or 20% problems, I think the basics, that solid foundation is really going to determine the 80% of whether you're going to be successful. It's fun to talk about design and aesthetics and all that's very important, right? But it's like, if you don't even know who your audience is, what you're trying to do, some of the basics, right? You're not even starting off on the right foot.
So I agree with that. It's ask the right questions because we usually ask the wrong ones. Check your bias far, far away. Don't think that you know better than everyone else, and try and encourage your teams to think that way as well. I'd say another thing is to embrace the outliers. People who ask a lot of these questions are often seen as troublemakers in an organization. They're independent thinkers. They're maybe the creative people that are just willing to not accept the status quo. And sometimes the answers come from them in a more cogent way than even a marvelous set of data because they do have the courage, they have the confidence, and they have the will to ask questions differently, to be skeptical. And I think that's really important in an organization. And it certainly feeds into the creative process of communicating with people is to, as Justin said, be curious, be open, get rid of your personal bias, but think differently. Think like people think. Don't think like your organization thinks.
I mean, just to riff off what Deborah said, I love skepticism, right? I heard an interview with Dan Rather where he talked about the difference between skepticism and cynicism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially working in bigger companies, it's easy for cynicism to breed and everyone to assume negative intent and that to breed status quo thinking. I think skepticism is very different where we're asking questions, we're challenging the status quo as a way of trying to drive forward and drive growth and drive
Absolutely.
outcomes, right? Which is a very different mindset.
Absolutely. It was an important group of philosophers.
So my final question for you both. Right? We have been talking about the integration of craft and data as if it's a natural partnership. And I think we've hit on it in multiple ways that it's not, because most organizations, these capabilities sit in different departments. They report to different leaders and rarely collaborate in any meaningful way. So what has to change organizationally, right? This podcast focuses on the human factor and majorly to change and transformation for this integration to actually happen. And what have each of you seen that either enables or prevents these two sides from working together effectively?
So this may be totally simplistic, but I think there's an assumption that creative people think very differently than analytics people. And so the creative bias is that the data people think very linearly. They don't, as we were talking about before, think holistically and how all of these things connect together into some kind of functional system. So the outlooks and the intellectual attitudes of these groups are so different that you need a way to bring them together and celebrate each other, not judge each other. And so you're already coming with a point of view that is like apples to oranges almost. The way I think is so different than when I talk to a lot of data people. They're very clear and very convinced about what they're saying, and I'm all over the place, but for a reason. So that's what I think disables it. To enable it, you've got to have you have to have a team. Everybody needs Justin, everybody. And not everyone has a Justin who thinks both ways and can bridge that gap and help us understand better instead of being antagonistic. There's this frisson that often exists between groups that think so differently, which is that bias that I know I'm right. So in the end, it's the leadership, the organizational leadership has to set up the environment, the culture, and the permission for everybody to work together and acknowledge and, as I said, celebrate, or at least not judge each other's differences. Figure out how you can work taking the best of both worlds together.
Thank you for the very kind words, Deborah. Yes, I think of it in a metaphor using oil as a metaphor. You have the raw oil, the raw product, and that's the data
The
that
crude.
sits, the crude product that sits. And on the other end, you have I've recently got really into Formula One. You've got the Formula One cars. You are the Max Verstappen of writers, like which is a high compliment, or Lewis Hamilton. Like you are a legend at what you do, right? But there's got to be someone who's refining the crude oil, the crude product, in order to bridge that gap between the artisan, the crafter, the person who is executing, and the data that's sitting as a raw product, right? Someone who can help bridge that gap. And it has been an aspect of what I've built my career on, which I think has been really beneficial for myself and for all the different situations that I've worked in, being able to kind of see both sides and help the data dwellers, the people who live in that crude product, kind of take what they've got, and there's so much potential there, and then connect that up with the people who are doing the craft, who are like making these beautiful things, but no one sees it, who have these brilliant ideas, these brilliant stories, but can't connect them with the right people. And it's when you can connect that data and the craft together, it's magic. Which is fun. It's one of the joys of my career, is being able to see when those two things have worked together. I mean, including many instances. I mean, the library, the Library of Congress, right, was a merriment of using technology and storytelling to come together to make magic happen, which is crazy that that was 20 years ago, right? But that's
Things
a
are,
perfect example.
but true things are true things.
I mean, and
We
that's the
tend to just ignore and forget them. Yeah.
common sense part. You take a great story and you can use technology to put it in front of the right people. People eat it up. And what was true 20 years ago now is a majority of what I talk about today, now with just an AI and data sweetener on top.
Well, I know that it's a cliche to talk about storytelling because it seems to be the au courant solution to everything, but it was always what connected us. And it started around the fires in Neolithic times, and it hasn't stopped. And it's the one piece where we feel connected, we find common ground, and we can learn to care about each other. But you have to be a really good storyteller to do it.
Amen.
Yeah. And we often forget the human side, right? The human factor of it all. So, Deborah, Justin, thank you both for this conversation. And what I hope our audience takes away is that effective communication during change, transformation, or any effort is not a data problem or a writing problem. It's an integration problem. And solving it requires both capabilities in the room, not in sequence, but really in a genuine partnership. Here's the core insight from today's episode. Every communication your organization sends either reinforces or erodes the psychological connection between you and the people that you are trying to reach. There's no neutral communication. Every email, every announcement, every newsletter is either building identity, trust, and behavioral embeddedness, or it's allowing those connections to fade. The organizations that communicate effectively during transformation are not the ones with the best data or the best writers. They are the ones that have figured out how to make those two capabilities work as a single system. Data without craft delivers precision without resonance. Craft without data delivers resonance without precision. Neither one alone moves people. Together, they change behavior. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you watch or listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and a comment and share this episode with your communication and marketing teams because this is the conversation they need to be having with each other. Subscribe to my Ideas and Innovations newsletter on 2040 Digital's website or on Substack for weekly frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. Connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post regularly about the psychology of transformation. And take the Transformation Readiness Assessment at transformationassessment.com. Next episode, we continue the journey. Until then, remember, change and transformation doesn't fail because of technology, strategy, or market conditions. It fails because of people. And the more deeply you understand the human factor, the more likely your transformation is to succeed. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.